way in which figures on the left took up the 1619 project was completely hysterical. This is Catherine Liu under the guise of caring about quote-unquote ordinary working people. The Oslo process is a failure. It's absolutely untenable, impractical. All it does is to lend credence to the legitimacy of the Zionist entity. There's no promise that the recognition of the Palestinian state will bring about an end to the genocide. So even then, 30 years ago, people were misusing Fanon in order to deride the Palestinian resistance.
Hello everyone and welcome to De Facto episode 21, all the way from Sydney, Australia. Today I am joined by Dr. Alana Lentin, Professor of Cultural and Social Analysis at Western Sydney University and member of its Institute for Culture and Society, as well as the founding collective member of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. Dr. Lentin is the author of several books, including Racism and Anti-Racism in Europe from 2004, The Crises of Multiculturalism, Racism in the Neoliberal Age, in a Neoliberal Age from 2009, Why Race Still Matters from 2020, and her most recent book, which is the topic of our conversation today, The New Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy, which was just recently put out by Pluto Books this past May, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, as usual, you can find links to all the above in the description box below. Dr. Lentin, thank you for joining me this evening. Well, it's evening for me. I think it's perhaps the morning for you over there.
Yeah, it's morning here. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. We're very thrilled to finally have you on the podcast. Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly has called the new racial regime accessible, rigorous, and unequivocal, and describes it as the principled treatise we sorely need today. In this book, you take on anti-wokeness and the distracting framings of culture wars and moral panics more generally, and argue that beneath these and other like phenomena, an undergirding racial logic is recalibrated, ultimately to reproduce white supremacy and racial capitalism. So, Dr. Lentin, I'd like to begin by asking you to provide sort of your own overview of this book, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how this book came to be, what inspired you, and what ultimately why did you endeavor to write it?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for the question, and thanks again for the invitation. Yeah, so the idea behind this book was it started off really as something I thought in my head had to be some kind of quick reaction to, if you remember back in 2020, the so-called war on critical race theory. This idea that critical race theory on the right was causing everything to go to hell in a handcart, to use a colloquialism. And you had Donald Trump at the end of his first presidency convening a conference on American history at the White House, where he was blaming critical race theory and other kind of woke ideologies, as he would put it, for the destruction of, the American way, as it were. And from then you had him signing an executive order at the end of 2020, banning the use of critical race theory in any kind of federal government training, documentation, and so on. And so when I looked at that, and we can go in, I guess, a little bit further later on into, the shape of that and what it actually looked like in terms of the politics and the policies and the media onslaught against it and so on, and the back and forth between the different positions on different political sides. But what I wanted to do, really coming off the back of the last book that I had just published, which you mentioned, Why Race Still Matters, which came out in, I think, April 2020, was to build on some of the ideas that I'd been shaping there to, I guess, react quickly to this new, moral panic, as some people talk about it, although I do critique the idea of it being a moral panic or a culture war in the book itself, but maybe, that's not so relevant right here. And so in my head, it would have been a short essay-like response. And I started to put the idea around, and there was good feedback. But one of the things that I heard, which I discussed briefly in the prologue, was that, well, by the time you sit down and research the book and write it and it comes out, in press, is this actually going to be an issue anymore? And I mean, I did have a smile about it because I think for those of us who are scholars of race and anti-racist activists and so on, we know that these things are constantly in a kind of a cycle. It's not that history repeats itself exactly, but that it rhymes, to use that expression. And so we can see these patterns coming up at various points of history. For example, in the book that I co-wrote with Gavin Titley, The Crises of Multiculturalism, which looked at this whole idea that multiculturalism was a failed experiment, that it had caused the inability for migrants to integrate into European societies or white societies in general, with no interrogation of the structuring formation of racism that causes this to be the case, or indeed to pose the idea of integration or social cohesion as issues, right, in the first place, without thinking about the colonial nature of that, the racist and supremacist nature of that. And before that, you had, of course, all of the backlash against political correctness way back, and books being written in the 1990s, as I mentioned, from people like Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic on the rights attack on, affirmative action and any kind of policies such as, affirmative action again, or diversity policies later on, to rectify racist discrimination within institutions through very, very kind of milquetoast policy making in the end of the day. So again, this is a cycle, this repeats. And what I wanted to do was just briefly respond to that. But as I'm saying, it wasn't necessarily something that, publishers leapt at because they felt that maybe it would be a done deal. And so, eventually Pluto did come onto the book. And what was happening at the same time in the background was that I was really kind of, I don't want to say losing interest, but my focus was no longer directly on the war on critical race theory itself, because I could see the magnitude that those kinds of arguments were taking. Other scholars, really, adept scholars like David Theo Goldberg, Victor Ray puts out a good book on critical race theory and the backlash against it. And I didn't feel that I necessarily had to add my voice into that. So at the same time, I was engaging very much with Cedric Robinson's work, not only with Black Marxism that I had been, engaging with and teaching for a number of years, and the ideas about the Black radical tradition that was coming, that come out of that book, but also with his other, I guess, lesser known works, the essays collected in the Pluto volume, edited by H.L.T. Kwon, and most importantly for this book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, his 2007 book, in which he lightly touches in the preface on this idea of a racial regime, but really carries that through the rest of his book in his analysis of the evolution of American cinema in the 20th century, from the start of the 20th century until the 1950s, which he says is kind of fundamental for the recalibration, as he puts it, of a racial regime, which is crucial for the formation of American nationalism and whiteness at a crucial time in the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for that. Yes, your detailed explication of Robinson's work in this text is quite striking, and I thought I'd ask you a question about a particular aspect of that explication, if that's okay. I'm very interested
Sure.
in this chapter, or the section of chapter 2 on race and time.
Mm,
In this chapter, you write, quote, "How we think about time is not neutral. Time is a tool of racializing power. Time can be given or taken away. It has been used to discipline negatively racialized people whose inability or refusal to live within strictures that are expressed in terms of time, wasting time, running out of time, is seen as evidence of their deficiency." So, Dr. Lentin, you've already introduced us and our audience to Cedric Robinson, and you've also talked a little bit about how Robinson's work has inspired and sort of spurred your own. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about this quote and this notion of race and time in relation to Robinson's notion of Black radical time and the time of Black resistance, and how these
mm,
concepts inform your argument and the challenge that you pose in this book against what you call history as conceived of as a balance sheet, or the way that
mm.
racial regime understands time linearly.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. And I think in order to make it cohere with the argument of the book and maybe to say a bit more about the racial regime, I'll try to knit these together. But if I don't do it sufficient justice, then please do press me to kind of knit it together to the rest of the question. The reason why the racial regime as Robinson introduces it in Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, became so important for the structuring of the book, was because of how he uses it in a very particular manner, not just to express how race is recapitulated. I mean, this is something that we already know. All race critical scholarship emphasizes the kind of the recursive nature of race, and also its scavenger-like ideology, the idea that it kind of fits itself to context. Stuart Hall talks about it sliding around the veranda and coming back in through the window, etc. Right? So the whole idea is that race is this, as Hall again would put it, this floating signifier that is quite polyvalent or flexible, hybrid. All of these kinds of words are constantly used in relation to race. But the reason why Robinson's explication, I think, is so useful for us to understand is that there's this constant tension between its recursive capacities and resistance from below, which emerges indeed out of what he calls the Black radical tradition and Black radical time, which is the time of Black resistance. So at all points, the racial regime, as he puts it, is pressed upon from below. And it's for this reason that it has to constantly recalibrate. It's not for, if race or any kind of structure of power was operating perfectly, like a clean machine, etc., and there was absolutely no cogs in the wheel, right? Or there was no, sorry, I'm using the wrong metaphor, no kind of spanner in the work, then they wouldn't have to at all adjust itself. It could just keep going, right? Like a perfectly oiled machine. But because there's constantly resistance to it, it obviously has to recalibrate itself, which means to readjust. And Robinson is clear that this isn't a wholesale, starting again from the beginning and, completely clean sheet. This is always kind of small adjustments to a script that is working quite well, but that needs to kind of, adjust itself once again. And, and we can see this in various ways, which is why the various scripts of race are very confusing and chaotic. And he talks about chaos as being much more truthful to how race works over time. It's not this kind of totalizing institution, again, this perfectly oiled machine. It's always this kind of chaotic and kind of assembled from here and there, building on and weaving through various kinds of, discourses, histories, lies, I say, are very important. Lying is extremely important to racism and so on. And all of this kind of builds this complex and rather, again, confusing and chaotic picture that we find it really hard to adjust to. But there are always cracks and there are always resistances. And of course, the people who are affected by race, who are dominated by it and oppressed and exploited by it, are those who are best placed to be able to resist to it, because simply it's their experience and they're able to show us. This is what Du Bois talks about, show us how it functions in ways that obviously people who are not affected by it in the same way are less able or often unable to do, and often resistant to doing, because of course the structures of white supremacy suit them rather well. And so how does this operate in relation to the question about history and the question about time? One of the central arguments in the war on critical race theory, so by the anti-critical race warriors, if you like to call them that, is that, those who use critical race theory, or those who, as they would see it, keep making everything about race, constantly want us to be stuck in time. They want us to be stuck at a time that they would argue is the time of racism. So racism is seen as being of the past. It's not seen as being of the present. And those who insist on talking about it are trying to anchor us in that past instead of moving on into, this glorious future in which we can all kind of walk hand in hand, which is why you see this really, really specious, twisting of Dr. King's ideas, right, into this, all Martin Luther King wanted to do was for everybody to get along kind of thing. And why can't we just do that? As if, that's what he was saying. But we've seen these motifs on the right going back a really long time. As I mentioned in the book, you have Ronald Reagan using Dr. King in the 1980s in order to object to affirmative action. So this is by no means a new thing. Anyway, so this idea of being stuck in the past, which, as I say in chapter 2 in the chapter on history, and the technologies of white forgetting is that often indigenous people are told, can you not just get over it? You're constantly going on about colonization and invasion and genocide, and please, just get on with it because now you're fine, everything is fine, and we just want to live together, etc. But of course, when you look at the abject nature of ongoing colonization, particularly in this continent where I am based, and I talk about it in the book, the constant daily almost theft of children from indigenous parents, the deaths and the murders in police custody, all of this, the levels of deprivation and poverty, impoverishment, and so on, structured impoverishment. Then obviously it's perverse to tell people to just get over it, right? So but nonetheless, this technology of time is extremely important in order to again recalibrate the racial regime, because of course it holds out this promise to negatively racialized people that yes, indeed, if they were just to get on with the program and kind of accept what racial liberalism is offering them, which is this notion of progress, social cohesion, I mentioned before, integration, assimilation, all of these kinds of things, then indeed everything would be better. But that's part of how the racial regime, of course, is constituted, by promising us this reality, or this it's not a reality, but this kind of this hope, if you like, which doesn't exist, which has to be militantly fought against. And this is something that Robinson speaks about quite often. He uses the word attack quite often. He says this actually has to be attacked, and it doesn't have to just be attacked once. It has to be attacked again and again.
Wow. No, thank you very much for that, um, for your answer. I think it elucidates quite a bit about that chapter. Um, Sort of piggybacking off of that, I'd like to ask you about some of these, let's call them recalibrations of white supremacy. Um, Various, you've sort of alluded to these already, but various fronts in the war on CRT, critical race theory, various positions, as you've already sort of alluded to, and your exploration thereof in throughout this work, really, in chapters 2, 3, and 4, if I'm not mistaken, as
Mm.
well as the attacks on the 1619 Project, for instance, not only from what we'd call the political right in this country and elsewhere, but from our so-called friends on the left as well.
Yeah.
Um, so I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about, alluding back again to history, the presentism controversy, AHA former AHA President James H. Sweet, this work by Catherine Liu, whom many
Mm.
know, but perhaps don't haven't read, perhaps. Um, World Socialist website, and some of these other attacks on the critical race theory, which exemplify, as you argue in the book, what Du Bois in the 1930s had already coined as the propaganda of history.
Mm.
Can you just speak to some of those positions and how they contribute to the recalibration of white supremacy in our present era?
Sure. And I want to thank you also because it's the conversations that you had with Dr. Horne which helped me to think through some of these attacks from the left. As you know, Dr. Horne always talks about our friends on the left. And I think even you tried to raise Catherine Liu with him in one of your conversations with him, and he kind of swept her aside, which I thought was, quite apt actually. But nonetheless, I did go there because, um, sorry, you
I
were
don't
going to
mean to
say
interrupt,
something.
but the conversation we had off camera was perhaps more compelling than the one we had on camera.
Yeah, he was very gracious on camera. But I do think it's interesting, and it's something that I've long been interested in. In fact, in my last book, in Why Race Still Matters, I have a chapter called Making It About Race, which again looks at these arguments from the left, which attack identity politics. And I also want to flag an excellent book by our friends Alex Charnley and Michael Richmond, Fractured, on Race, Class, and the Hatred of Identity Politics, which I think is an excellent book, which looks at the history of all of this from a Black feminist perspective. Anyway, in the book, what I try to do, because if you think about the 1619 Project, which I think, nobody talks about really, it's really funny how things move on so quickly, right? So this was creating so much fuss, and really today, with everything that's going on, Trump 2.0, the genocide in Gaza, ICE raids everywhere, the border issues that you're having in the United States and everything. Nobody's talking about this anymore. It's like this great racial reckoning moment when there was all this investment in teaching people about the history of slavery and colonialism and genocides past is kind of, we've all forgotten about that, or at least the people who were so taken with it at the time from both sides of the argument are kind of not speaking about it anymore. Nonetheless, the 1619 Project, which, just to recap for people who may not remember or don't know, was a sort of a special issue of the New York Times that was edited by the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, who'd, I think, done some good work on school segregation, for example, in the past. That's how I knew her, at least. And she put out this collection of essays on the 1619 moment as being the moment that she says was foundational to the birth of the whole idea of the United States, because that's the date that she put down as kind of the beginning of the arrival of the first captured African people to the shores of what later became the United States, Turtle Island, of course, and the beginning of slavery. Now, of course, there's many debates about whether we can say that's the date. Does it predate that? Can we call it slavery, as in were African people the only object of slavery at this time? All of these kinds of things are well taken. The other thing that needs to be said, I think, quite early on in this discussion is that there's been some very good critique, which unfortunately I didn't have the space to elaborate on in the chapter, but there's been some very good critique from Indigenous scholars, particularly about the absence of Indigenous people from this history that Nicole Hannah-Jones presented in that book for the main part. The other thing which is eminently criticizable about this project is the fact that Hannah-Jones has a very kind of, I would say, American patriotic bent to her argument, particularly in her opening essay when she talks about her father having, I think, in the military, and she talks about the American flag and the fact that she needs to see herself as a Black woman identified in the American flag, in American ideology. I think this is quite a specious, extremely specious approach to it. Nonetheless, my point, to get back to the point in this chapter, is that the way in which figures on the left, never mind figures on the right, took up the 1619 Project was completely hysterical, right? And they used it because they weren't interested in the kinds of critiques that I've made. That wasn't the argument. The argument that you saw coming through in the World Socialist website and people like what do they call themselves? Yeah, WSW. I can't even remember what they call themselves. Or from Catherine Liu, who, as far as I know, is a professor of cultural studies. As Dr. Horne said, she's definitely not a specialist of slavery, or she's neither is she a historian, even a U.S. historian, a historian of the U.S. Nonetheless, she took it upon herself to argue that the arguments that Nicole Hannah-Jones was using in order to discuss the history of slavery were inaccurate. And the main point of contention was something, and this is why I think you were asking Dr. Horne to respond to it, was something that that Hannah-Jones takes from Horne's thesis on U.S. history. And in particular, the one point that she made was that when enslaved people rose up against the system of slavery, that they generally fought alone. And this was the main point of contention, because the argument was not only that the 1619 Project was making everything about race, and not just everything about race, but everything about slavery. So everything that's wrong with the U.S. society today can be linked back to slavery, which they see as incorrect. I mean, and these people are not even thinking about the genocide of Indigenous people and ongoing colonialism on Turtle Island. That's not their issue. Their issue is that class, of course, trumps race, and that you cannot say that people who live in the United States today, who are not descendants of slaves or who had never suffered slavery, don't face disadvantage, which is, of course, not the argument of any kind of serious critic of race as it works through class and vice versa, right, etc. But this main point that the enslaved people generally had to fight alone is actually a historical truth, right? So this whole idea of reinventing the fight against racism as somehow, a fairy tale of black and white unite and fight is something that, has just been laid bare by the truth of history, and something that I think people on the left find it very, very difficult to contend with. But I think that argument, and it's all been meshed together with these, as I sort of alluded to before, these gut reactions against something being called identity politics, which is, Charnley and Richmond very, very carefully elucidate in their book, has nothing to do with the actual history of identity politics, but something that they kind of resist against because they feel that it kind of takes away from the larger, more universalizing struggle of the population against, or the masses against the ruling class. And Liu's argument, of course, is that because the 1619 Project had then been taken up by the Pulitzer Foundation, I guess, and republished, firstly a book came out based on the New York Times special issue, and I think there was even an HBO, I want to say, series or production. And there were even educational materials that were produced, which of course sent all the anti-critical race theory warriors mental, because how could you have this, this 1619 stuff being rolled out in K to 12 education? That for them was, and of course it was banned directly in many states.
Right.
Anyway, so but the point for Liu specifically and her fellow travelers is that because it was funded, or partly funded, or promoted at least, by the Pulitzer organization, that this completely discounted its relevance, its historical and political relevance, because this was all an effort. In her book is actually on the professional managerial class, and the whole thing is an effort by this so-called PMC to exert its power over the ordinary masses. And the implication of all of that is that the ordinary masses basically don't care about the history of slavery, that it couldn't be. And it comes back to the question about time, because of course the driving message here is get over it. It's in the past, and today we all have to struggle together. But of course, as Robinson and others, be it all black radical scholars and any kind of anti-racist scholars will tell you, we obviously can't. I mean, not only is there racism in the present that has to be fought against, but also if we have no historical theory of how we get to this, we get to the place that we're in today, then we have very, very little means of struggling against it.
Excellent. Yes. I mean, that last point you make, I think, speaks to what you describe in the book as history, the battleground of history.
Hmm.
History itself is something that we must struggle with. And that's part of what you're doing in this book. I'd like to read a quote here having to do with Liu. And because I can't get over the irony of her critique of the 1619 Project and its elite funding structures and so forth. And some of the things that you point out in your text, which are very interesting, and I think will be very interesting to our audience. This is from page 106 going on, 107 going on 108 in your text. It is odd that Liu is comfortable in the reactionary rights orbit, but she can be best suited in the, quote, Tucker Carlson left, which coalesces around a grab bag of positions, including defending traditionalism, an embrace of nationalism, and the rejection of wokeness. This is evidenced in her thanking of a Koch brothers funded Spiked magazine for publishing the first review of her book. We can read her in Koch adjacent Quiet magazine, known for its publication of eugenicist pseudoscience posing as dangerous ideas. Spiked's intellectual guide, the sociologist Frank Freddy, spoke at the 2022 far-right CPAC conference hosted by the fascist Hungarian premier Viktor Orban, which, if I'm not mistaken, took place in Texas, as well as, yeah, I believe it did, as well as the 2023 National Conservatism Conference, which opens this chapter. I'd also like to add, if she's so quick to indict the 1619 Project for its funding, perhaps we should ask why she's receiving funding from the Peter Thiel-backed Compact magazine, for instance.
Oh, there's that as well.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't get over the irony of her position that you so thoroughly take to task in this text.
I mean, I think that these are reactionary right-wing people posing as left-wing people. Um, I think that's just obvious. We could get into the whole history of the Revolutionary Communist Party, out of which Spiked emerges, but I don't think we need to bore the listeners. But it is very instructive to read a good article by the historian Evan Smith on that history that people can Google. It's a very particular British formation, but it has been very influential over a very kind of rapid, I think, move to legitimize extremely right-wing reactionary views under the guise of we're just here to air dangerous ideas. They even have a festival of danger. I think it's called the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, organized by the Spiked, group.
Mhm.
It's kind of a magazine which emerged out of an earlier magazine called Living Marxism. And if you're wondering why Marxism or communism has anything to do with this, you need to go and read the history of it, because it really is rather murky. I mean, some people say that they were entryists and that's how it began, but I don't think we can say that somebody like Furedi, who exactly, parades around with Viktor Orban and other even more right-wing figures, has any kind of, any kind of foot in the camp of communism today. And they've been responsible for pushing violently transphobic narratives, violently Zionist narratives, anti-Palestinian, you name it, right? They're right there at the forefront of it. And for somebody who claims to be a leftist like Liu, but she's definitely far from being the only one. I mean, this is just writ large across a whole group of people who regularly write for, again, Colette magazine, that often, I mean, particularly during COVID, their coverage of COVID was so eugenicist. They've been in bed with various figures, like academic figures who were involved with kind of eugenicist research. I talk about this in my last book. There was one person, now he had a really funny name. His name was Jonathan. His name is Jonathan Anomaly. He wrote an article which appeared in the Monash Bioethics Review. So this is an academic journal, um, on in defense of liberal eugenics, as he calls it, and another person whose name was Noah Carl, who was a researcher at Cambridge University, who was fired because he was basically doing racial science, and then this whole group of people who are academics. I mean, there was this is all from my last book. It's in there. Eric Kaufman, who was a political scientist at Birkbeck University, Birkbeck College, who now left Birkbeck to go to this kind of independent university where he's free to spout his, intensely violent views. Matthew Goodwin, another extremely right-wing British academic. All of these people clubbed together to raise, I think it was £100,000 for Noah Carl after he was dismissed from Cambridge University. And these are all people in the same orbit. But and another person who's really at the forefront of all of this is Kathleen Stock, who left the University of Sussex because she was violently transphobic, but of course then was compensated by the university and has now basically, all of these people have very lucrative careers on the speaker's circuit, on the writer's circuit, putting into mainstream public opinion these extremely violent, racist, transphobic, etc. Views, often under the guise, and this is Catherine Liu, under the guise of caring about quote unquote ordinary working people.
Mhm.
Now, if you take a snapshot of the United States, for example, and you look at who the ordinary working people are, I would wager that most of them don't feel represented by Liu's views. Um, anyway, we could go, a lot further, but there's a lot of really, really dangerous stuff out there.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's an excellent response. And thank you for all that additional context referring to your other work. And can you just repeat the name of that work about the history of the Revolutionary Communist Party and the spike?
Oh, it's an article by Evan Smith.
Ian Smith.
I think it's in The Guardian.
I think
But
you
no, he
covered.
also no, he has some articles in The Guardian. No, he also has a journal article, but I don't remember what journal it's published in.
We will look. I will look into that, and I will have it
Yeah,
linked.
I can send it to you later.
For sure. That would be perfect. Thank you. Um, I'd like to move on to the chapter three, institutionalizing dissent in a time of genocide. And very taken with this chapter as I was your other chapters. But in this chapter, you write about, for instance, the ADL's cementing of the definition of racism as hate, which bonds it to speech acts and thereby couches the effects of racism in an amorphous feeling of unsafety experienced by individuals, detaching it from institutional power and state power. Um, I want to ask you, and actually, you know what? That's such a, the second part of that quote is, I think, important as well. If I have it here. The international reach of this partial definition is made possible by the fact that it coheres with a generalized understanding of racism as volitional and morally vicious, rather than systematically reproduced within racial institutions undergirded by a racial regime. So, Dr. Lentin, I want to ask you about the ADL, AMCHA, the AMCHA initiative, rather, Yes 23, Jimena, if I'm saying that correctly, Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, or any other like instances of, as you describe them, state-approved anti-racism and
Hmm.
the way dissent has been institutionalized. For instance, how some of these institutions, organizations, or campaigns selectively piggyback, as you put it, on CRT, while also painting the latter and disciplines like ethnic studies as uniquely anti-Semitic in turn. How
Yeah.
might the new racial regime help us think through this, what seems like a contradictory phenomena?
Yeah, thanks. So, chapter three is institutionalizing dissent in a time of genocide, as you said. And I need to kind of set this in the context of the writing of the book. So, the book I started writing in 2022, and then I wrote a chapter in 2023. I think I wrote the history chapter in 2023, and then it came to almost the end of 2023 when we saw on the 7th of October of that year the uprising of Palestinian people in Gaza, which has led to the onslaught that we're currently witnessing by Israel against Palestinians, that has been ongoing ever since, of catastrophic dimensions. And so when I was thinking about where I wanted to go with the rest of the book, I mean, I had a plan for the book, but it kind of threw everything up in the air. And I had to really seriously think about, well, what does this phase of Israel's genocide mean for how I'm thinking about the racial regime? And that's why you'll see that the book um, kind of is divided into two parts, in the sense that the first three chapters, if we include the introduction, is rather a long introduction, deal with the racial regime and the war on critical race theory and the questions of history that we've just been discussing. The last three chapters are all in their various ways focused on the politics of this genocide as they relate to the racial regime. Now, the third chapter, the focus of the third chapter was always going to be, but it fit rather well with that context. My intention was to look at critical race theory itself and think about, well, again, it's not enough just to criticize those who attack critical race theory, although we must, because I think those attacks, as I say in chapter 2, have got basically nothing to do with critical race theory itself, but really are an attack on Black, Indigenous, and anti-colonial thought, which has been long-standing, as Du Bois points out in Black Reconstruction, for example, with his discussion of the historians. Um, but what critical race theory itself, as a particular branch of critical legal theory, how that sets up questions of structural and institutional racism, and what it sometimes elides, might kind of open up certain questions to us about what needs still to be done from our perspective as scholars and thinkers of who want to undo race, obviously, and the structures of racism. What still needs to be done to be able to theorize that more adequately? So what are the lacunae of critical race theory itself? Part of the problem with doing that, I'm sorry, I'm taking a kind of a wide detour to get back to your question, but part of the problem of doing that is that we have a certain amount of confusion around, which it's not really confusion, but there's been a widening of the terms of reference when it comes to critical race theory. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's often named as one of the founders of critical race theory, herself says at one point, which I quote in the book, that it's often used as interchangeably for other things as we use Kleenex for tissue, which is something that people in the United States do. We don't say Kleenex, but anyway, we'll we'll leave that to you. But anyway, so we know what she means, and so often critical race theory is kind of extended to mean any kind of studies of race, right? And that's not actually its lineage, right? So the lineage of critical race theory, it's founded, if you like, by a group of scholars in and around Derek Bell, who was a Harvard law professor. It was around the insufficiencies of Marxist-inflected critical legal theory, with its, its well-founded critique of kind of the U.S. legal system and its inattentiveness to class and inequality, but the inability of that perspective to incorporate race. So these mainly black scholars, not all black, were introducing the element of race in order to look at what Charles Mills, for example, would call the racial contract as being kind of endemic to the foundations of so-called U.S. democracy. But what that means is that the focus is very much on the institutions and legal infrastructures of the United States. And while critical race theory has been extended in various other locations, it nevertheless has this specific lineage. And that's why very often what goes under the name of critical race theory often veers quite far away from those origins, right? And so what I wanted to do here in this book was not use critical race theory in its maximalist kind of formulation, but really think about, well, that group of the originators of critical race theory, what within their writings might pose us some problems when we want to try to use that body of knowledge in order to attack the kinds of structures and the kinds of, again, to come back to Robinson, the confusion that race seeds, right? So it's not always so obvious in institutions and, for example, in laws and policies to see the functioning of race as much as the critical race theorists would kind of imply. And we need to be more attentive to the often very contradictory messages that the racial regime, to use that formulation, works with and through. And so what I noticed, and what many people noticed at the start of this genocide, was that many people, and many people have discussed this, but that many scholars who one would assume would be at the forefront of attacking Israel for its genocide and doing everything within their power, within their institutions, for example, within universities, to oppose this and to protect Palestinian lives and to protect and stand up for the students who were bravely protesting and so on, that they would be the ones to be doing this. But rather, what was found was that some very significant voices were silent. And rather than try to treat this as a question of pointing fingers at individuals, which frankly doesn't interest me, nor do I think that's useful, I wanted to try to think about this epistemically through this discussion of what critical race theory might not be able to do. And one of the things that I found that I don't think it's sufficiently able to do in its original formulation, and notwithstanding the fact that, for example, some indigenous scholars have reworked or worked with critical race theory to extend it into a critique of settler colonialism, for example, notwithstanding the efforts of people to kind of think synergetically, as the Cambridge sociologist Ali Megji has done to great effect, I think, talks about a theoretical synergy between CRT and decolonial approaches. All of this work, which is excellent and which I discuss in the book, notwithstanding all of that, in its original form, CRT has a lack of focus on colonialism and imperialism, and for that reason, I think, is epistemically not well placed to be able to provide us a kind of a theoretical basis for making those attacks, and that might be the explanation for why, as I discuss in the book, Kimberly Crenshaw, for example, even though critical race theory and intersectionality, which she's often, it's often seen as being her formulation, that is specifically attacked by And I'll get on to the ADL and other people like that in a minute in order to knit this together. But that's specifically attacked by some of these people, some of these Zionist voices, as being anti-Semitic, actually. And we can get on to that. So even though actually the attack on critical race theory was often coming from those characters, she went to Cornell University at a time when students, including Mamadou Tall, who had to flee the United States basically, and other brave students were standing up against Cornell's investments and partnerships with the Zionist regime, and had nowhere to say about these, not just the genocide, but also these attacks on students, but had many things to say about the attacks on critical race theory and wokeness from the right, exclusively from the right, and actually put out, when we start to listen attentively to how she discusses the need to defend critical race theory, she says on a podcast at a certain point that to respect critical race or to work with critical race theory would be to contribute to the perfecting of American democracy. Right. That actually it's those who attack critical race theory who are not the real American Democrats, not the Democratic Party, but democratic principled people and so on. So I think that's rather telling about what the affordances of critical race theory is, which is not to say that there haven't been principled stances taken by critical race theorists about the genocide. For example, Mari Matsuda, who was one of the founders of critical race theory, has been, openly speaking out about this, which is why, again, I don't think it's useful to look at individuals. It's just that the Crenshaw case was very, very particular. Now, to try to knit this back to the question of particular groups and the attacks on critical race theory. So you have a long-standing attack by Zionist groups in the United States. This is principally in the United States, but of course, this is the borders extend when it comes to sort of Zionist organizing, if you like, that have been opposed more so to ethnic studies, to critical ethnic studies, than to critical race studies or critical race theory. And this is actually telling because, of course, one of the arguments from the right is that was in the context of the so-called war on critical race theory was that critical race theory was everywhere, that was being taught in K-12 education, that it was writ large across all of this kind of diversity training being done in, local government, within the school system, all the rest of it. And that was one of those arguments that was really forcefully put out there and which caused a lot of, or which seemed to cause a lot of fear among ordinary quote unquote parents and so on. But of course, we know that this was a lot of astroturfing happening. So it wasn't like it wasn't a grassroots concern. It was very much manufactured from on high. But actually, more than critical race theory, the thing that people were opposed to for much longer was ethnic studies, because there had been various proposals on the table to include ethnic studies within the curriculum, specifically in California, where there was a successful campaign to indeed teach ethnic studies in K-12 education. So one of the things that I find very interesting is that when this war on critical race theory came on the agenda, a lot of people said, oh, but don't worry, it's not actually being taught anywhere. It's all, a storm in a teacup. But my point was, well, A, it should be taught, but B, also, it is sometimes, or these ideas are sometimes being taught. So why aren't we defending that rather than telling people not to worry? There's nothing to worry about. They're not actually teaching it. I thought that was relatively interesting. Anyway, so activists around critical ethnic studies in California specifically were facing a lot of backlash from quarters that one might find surprising, because they were coming from these Zionist organizations who were posing themselves as anti-racist organizations. Groups like the ADL, who you mentioned, so this is the Anti-Defamation League, without getting into the long history of the ADL and its specious participation along with the United States government in campaigns to victimize and criminalize Black radicals and Palestinian radicals through counterterrorism legislation and so on. I highly recommend the work of Emea Gelman, who's the director of the Institute for the critical study of Zionism, who's the sort of the expert on all of this. But the point that I want to make in order to link it to my work, and the reason why I've written about it here, is because groups like the ADL and the Amcha initiative, which you mentioned, others like Stand With Us and the Fair Story curriculum and all of these groups, was that they were involved or are involved in education around racism in the United States, and the promotion of a particular narrative on racism, which has become really, really problematic because we've seen how it's being rolled out, particularly in the context of this genocide, in order to repress free speech and protest on the matter of Palestine. And that is the reduction of racism to the question of individual hate or prejudice. And so the point, to come back to critical ethnic studies, was that when people were pushing for or mobilizing for ethnic studies to be included in the curriculum, coming from these organizations was the critique that it was anti-Semitic because it paid too much attention to anti-colonial resistance, specifically that of the Palestinians, and that it didn't include the perspective of Jewish people within this. Now, of course, when we think about, well, what does this mean, right? We know today what this means. When you say you don't include the perspective of Jewish people, you're sandwiching Jewish people together with Zionist positions, as though, and we've seen this now, it is basically encoded in the US law since some months, that Zionism is a protected now identity category, treated the same way as a category along the lines of race, religion, ethnicity, and so on. And this starts here, right? So this idea that you're sending the wrong message to children and young people by teaching them about Palestine, because that would be to exclude de facto the identity or to negate the identity of Jews who were portrayed as, for the main part, being Zionists, and therefore that would be an attack on their identity. And so Newsom, as the governor of California, and of course this ramps up after 2023, after October 2023, because this provides new impetus for these attacks on critical ethnic studies. And Newsom, the governor of California, puts in these guardrails on the critical ethnic studies curriculum, where basically you couldn't say this and you couldn't say that. So effectively ruling out any discussion of Palestine from the critical ethnic studies curriculum. And I mean, I think the last thing I want to say on this is that this is not a local, I mean, I think I've already given a flavor of how this is not just a local problem, but rather a writ large, because data from the Anti-Defamation League, which now, thankfully, in the context of this genocide, has been criticized and has led to, being pushed out from various structures because it's just so obvious the degree to which it lies. But data from the ADL studies, so-called, of, I mean, there's no kind of, I don't want to see the ethics committee that approved, whatever studies they're doing, but basically studies of anti-Semitism, where the rise in anti-Semitic incidents just goes up and up and up exponentially, and that this is used as a means, as a reason to ban and repress and fire people for any kind of pro-Palestine sentiment. But the data is completely, fictive. The data is things like, I saw a pro-Palestine sticker, or a student in a cafe was making me feel unsafe. I mean, that's the data when it comes to anti-Semitic incidents. And we have to be very clear about this, because I think even progressive, and to not say anti-Zionist, but, kind of critical of Zionism organizations that are out there at the moment, are still using the language of exponential rise in anti-Semitism at the same time as trying to defend the right to protest in favor of Palestine. And I think actually this is quite irresponsible, because what we have seen is a massive increase in anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-Muslim, Islamophobic racism, including violence, but not just physical violence, also institutional violence and repression. And we've seen nothing but a kind of a rolling out of the red carpet for the most extreme Zionist positions under the guise of protecting Jews from anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in a late chapter in your book, in the book you write about this presentation of anti-Semitism as being everywhere and growing, and that certainly
Mm,
meshes with these quote unquote studies that the ADL has produced. And you also mention the criminalizing essentially of the display of even the visual display of Palestinian symbolism, keffiyeh,
mm,
black,
yeah.
red, green, so forth, as being just written off as being anti-Semitic whole cloth. So I really appreciate that, and I actually really appreciate that wide context that you provided us. I think it really was excellent. Um, Part of those efforts also are, of course, something else you talk about in the book, the hierarchizing of anti-Semitism and the singularizing of anti-Semitism as the most important form of racism, essentially. I
Mm.
wonder if you have anything to add, or if you've kind of already covered that ground.
I mean, in the fifth chapter of the book, I try to locate this more historically, and it builds on work that I did in my last book. So, in the last chapter of Why Race Still Matters, I think I spent a lot of time talking about the politics of exceptionalizing anti Semitism and the idea that the fight against anti Semitism has become what I'd called a proxy for anti racism. And I build on the French Algerian decolonial scholar Horia Bouteldja's work on state philo-Semitism,
Mhm.
which she explains as being the mode through which the French state, in the case that she's looking at, kind of imposes compulsory Zionism on the population. So this is, work that she did in the kind of around 2015, 2016, leading up to her 2017 book, Whites, Jews, and Us. So it's not a recent problem, right? This is going back at least 10 years. I mean, she's writing about it in the last 10 years, but of course it's a more long-standing problem. And in my work, what I've tried to do is talk about how the idea that anti-Semitism provides a kind of a blueprint for all forms of racism emerges not immediately after the Holocaust. In fact, there's quite a blanket silence about the Holocaust for at least 2 decades. But afterwards, with the growing needs of the Zionist state to manipulate anti Semitism as a mechanism for ensuring its dominance over Palestinians. And you have great analysis of this from many Palestinian scholars, for example, Fayez Sayegh in his important work on Zionism and colonialism and his work on Zionism and racism leading up to the UN resolution and so on. You have, and this is going back to the 1960s, right? You have this growing use of the history of the Holocaust, which had been rather silenced in Europe and not spoken about to the extent that it is today at all, suddenly coming onto or gradually coming onto the agenda as being the main, um, narrative that undergirds and justifies Zionist colonialism, even though, as we know, when the Holocaust survivors came to Palestine after 1948, they were often treated extremely badly. And in fact, many Holocaust survivors who remain alive today are living in poverty in so-called Israel. So there's never been this kind of great appreciation for the actual victims of the Holocaust, right? Not nonetheless, what you have in the European narrative very much, and I think this extends to the United States, but it really originates in Europe, is this idea that Europe's own racism, which is seen as racism against the Jews, because of course no other racism is even discussed, even the racisms against Roma and Sinti, for example, who suffered alongside Jews in the concentration camps within the context of the Nazi genocide. But certainly not Europe's colonial crimes. For example, only more recently have people started to talk about the genocides that the Germans committed against the Nama and Ovaherero people in current Namibia, and the use of concentration camps there, for example. But of course, like the enormous and untold, unbounded crimes of British, French, Portuguese, Dutch, and Belgian colonialism for many centuries before this are not discussed. But what you have is this kind of picking out of this exceptional history of Europe's own genocide. And in fact, it's very instructive, and this is what I talk about to some extent in the fifth chapter of the book. the particular case of Germany, which is really kind of exceptional, is exceptional in its grotesque defense of almost everything absolutely everything that Israel is doing in the context of this genocide. You have this notion that it's ours, right? And actually, I'm just thinking about this now, quite interestingly mirrored in the language of the Israeli, sort of human rights group that came out last week, finally admitting that a genocide was happening. They talked about it as our genocide. And I think even though that's supposed to be like a sense of ownership, but I think it's also very interesting because there is this notion, particularly in Germany, that because it was theirs, that they are also the only authorities on it. And there's almost a writing out of the words of actual, actual descendants of the survivors and the victims of the Holocaust who are objecting to what Israel is doing and saying this is a genocide. And the Germans are saying, but only we, as the actual perpetrators of the genocide, are the people who are able to tell you that this is actually a genocide or not, right? So that's very, very interesting. So what I'm trying to say, however, is in this particular work is that we need to go beyond the narratives of exceptionalization and think very clearly about how narratives of Jewish safety, which really connects to the discussion that we had before about how Zionism has become a protected identity, etc., or been made into a protected identity, how these narratives of Jewish safety are really the expression of white supremacy today. And I think what we have is that we have Europeans and Westerners in particular placing themselves in the shoes of a chimeric figure of the Jew. It doesn't have to be an actual Jewish person, right? And almost identifying themselves in the position of victimization that they have built a narrative around Jewish people being in, right? So this is why we constantly have this return to what Hamas supposedly did on the 7th of October as the second Holocaust or the worst kind of atrocity, while an actual Holocaust is happening against Palestinian people, because actually what's at stake is the entire attack, to use Robinson's advisor terms again, on the entire edifice of Western civilization, which, whether or not they actually express it openly, Westerners know is happening, right? That actually Western civilization, and again, I don't want there to be a thought that I think that there's an actual thing called Western civilization. This is obviously a narrative or an ideology, but this ideology that Westerners identify with has always been illegitimate, perversely so, and therefore that's under attack and always has been, right? And has needed to have been because it needs to be destroyed. And so they place themselves in the shoes of the people they have told are the perfect victims, to, use Mohammed El-Kurd's phrase, which of course were the Holocaust victims, because they didn't resist, they didn't fight back. I mean, they did, but they were shown as not, or it was said that they were the perfect victims who were like lambs to a slaughter and all the rest of it, which, by the way, was the thing that the Zionists hated them for. They hated them for going, as they saw it, like lambs to a slaughter and not fighting back. But nonetheless, there's this kind of, and so we're placing this, the Europeans and the Westerners place themselves in the shoes of the absolute perfect victims, who are under onslaught from all sides. And of course, in the racist European imagination, Hamas are the migrants coming to Europe and usurping the so-called indigenous people. And of course, there's a manipulation of the concept of indigeneity by Europeans also, right? But at the same time, Israel, as in attacking, as they would see it, Hamas, of course, there are no innocent Palestinians as they would see it, is doing what the West wishes it could do against, migrants and Muslims and so on, which of course it is doing, because we see the deaths in the Mediterranean, or the killing, basically the state-induced deaths in the Mediterranean. We see the abject treatment of people at the border. We see the police killings and shootings and all of the other abject forms of ongoing racism. So it's not that they're not doing it, but they wish that they, and Douglas Murray, the right-wing journalist, has said this openly, the West needs to defend itself, and Israel provides us a blueprint for doing so. So I think this narrative, just to end, this narrative of Jewish safety is much more specious than just exceptionalizing anti-Semitism and refusing to think about it
Mhm.
relatively to other forms of racism, which is of course important to do, but has become a kind of thing that now, again, we hear this progressive Jewish organizations, for example, constantly say. I don't think they read my book, but I kind of blame myself because I did say this in my last book. But I think, that's where my thinking was at the time. But I think now, I think we need to take one step further and think very critically and seriously, also for myself as a Jewish anti-Zionist person, how we speak about anti-Semitism and and the future of Jewishness or Judaism is actually very important, because we have a responsibility not to recapitulate that narrative or to reinvigorate those narratives, victimhood, safety, all of these kinds of things, because they're not detachable from the ways in which they're being used in the service of Zionism and white supremacy.
Mhm. Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for that extended answer. Do you have time? I know we're over time, but do you have time for a couple more questions?
Sure, yeah.
Sure. Um, I want to ask you in a moment about what you call the manipulation of indigeneity in the European continent, but also here in the United States is something that's
Mm,
quite rampant. But just before that, I can't help but think about going back to your answer and what you were saying about the singularization of anti-Semitism in the German context. Uh,
mm,
Recently, I was doing some research on Ho Chi Minh, and as early as maybe 1920, 21, he was writing about the genocide in Namibia, Germany's genocide of the
mm,
non-Nuer people. And people should take note that he was doing so before Freud, before Adorno, before Habermas certainly ever even got around to doing so in their,
mm,
Habermas is still alive. And I think Germany, yeah, I know that might come as a shock to some people. Um, but um, it took Germany, I think, till maybe 2020, 2021, perhaps, to even recognize officially that that genocide took place,
yeah.
let alone start to discuss reparations for that
Mm,
particular genocide. And I mention these names because these are the paragon and paramount intellectuals of the German tradition. They say nothing about that event.
mm.
They say, not a word. You'll never find that word spoken or written in any of their works. And I think that's quite telling also. And that's just something I wanted to mention.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let me ask you about the way the academics have used and manipulated the rhetoric of shared indigeneity, self-determination, even land back, and other indigenous claims, as you put it, that are wielded in order to secure colonial power. You write about this in the fourth chapter of your book, and I just found that to be a very compelling argument.
Thanks. I mean, again, in this chapter, which is called Capturing Indigeneity, Colonizing Decolonization, what I wanted to do was to link it to something that I feel that I'm placed to write about, which is the argument that Jews are indigenous to Palestine, and they would say Israel,
Mhm.
and that therefore that this legitimizes um, Israel's ongoing genocide against the Palestinians, um, not just the current phase of the genocide, but when I talk about genocide against the Palestinians, I'm talking about it in relation to the Zionist project writ large, because it has been a genocidal project since its inception. Um, and what I found particularly interesting was the ways in which specific Zionist organizations and individuals were building on and using narratives about indigeneity formulated by indigenous peoples under colonization in settler colonies, including Australia, which is where I'm based. And one would think, because the grand majority of indigenous people stand with Palestinians as indigenous people, and there is some interesting discussion about Palestinian identity and indigeneity. Stephen Salaita's work is the most important in this regard. and there's been some kind of differences of opinion, for example, around whether or not Palestinians, should refer to themselves as indigenous. And that's very interesting, but that's not necessarily relevant to the discussion here. But suffice it to say that the grand majority of indigenous people around the world identify with Palestinians as fellow indigenous people, as colonized people. And one of the things that I insist upon, which because I think there is some confusion, and confusion that's manipulated by Zionists, for example, that indigenous as a category is a category invented by colonizers. Indigenous people were not indigenous prior to colonization. They were the peoples that they were, right? They were the members of the nations and tribes that they belonged to, very specific to often the land on which, or always the land on which they're based. They didn't have a name for themselves, indigenous. Indigenous is the name that was imposed upon them by colonizers. But that's often obfuscated in the ways in which Zionists manipulate completely fictive biblical narratives in order to instill this idea that that Jewish people have this history going back to this particular land, thousands and thousands of years, and that this therefore legitimizes their settlement and occupation of that land and their dominance over the indigenous inhabitants. Nonetheless, certain alliances have been built between particular Zionist figures in the location I'm most familiar with, but it also exists in other places. The location I'm most familiar with, which is in Australia, between particular Zionist figures and particular indigenous leaders, where there has been kind of a compulsory imposition of a Zionist position, despite the fact that, as I'm saying again, the grand majority of indigenous people identify with Palestine. So I talk about this in a specific way in this book in order to exemplify it. But what I want to be absolutely clear about is that firstly, I'm building on analyses done by indigenous people on this continent. This is not something that just came to me, on my own. I'm building on those that very important work that's being done by others. That's a really important thing to say. But the other thing I want to say is that this is exemplary of a wider and deeper problem around the manipulation of indigeneity, which we can also see as an ongoing practice of all projects of colonization, particularly settler colonialism, where self-indigenization by settlers or invaders has always been an extremely important mechanism for legitimizing settler presence and settler futurity. Because if you cannot instill the idea, and it comes back to this idea of I think that I spoke about earlier around Western civilization, people know, settlers and invaders know that they're illegitimately present on indigenous land. And that's why, and again, this speaks to the idea of the racial regime. This is why there's this constant need to, recalibrate the terms of reference. And that's why we have the possibility for narratives or even policies, even what look like on their face very progressive policies, being institutionalized within universities or government and so on, why that becomes part of the story of the racial regime, right? So one of the things that I look at in the book is the way in which narratives of indigeneity and self-determination become folded into the practices of colonial universities in order to further the work of the colonial university and to obfuscate its role in ongoing settler colonization. Anyway, to come back to the story of the link to Zionism, and what I noticed was a certain collusion between particular Zionist figures and a project of some indigenous people together with the government in 2022 to take to referendum a voice to parliament, an indigenous voice to parliament. And there had to be a change in the Australian constitution in order to bring this about, because they wanted for indigenous people to be recognised within the Australian constitution as the first peoples of Australia, and for a permanent indigenous voice to parliament to be installed, and that this had to be voted on through a referendum, or so they said. I go into great detail in the book about the nature of that, so maybe there's no need for it here. But what I wanted to point out was that based on this analysis by indigenous, by certain indigenous activists who I have interviewed and who I've read their critiques. They noticed the involvement of a particular Zionist figures in this campaign to bring about the indigenous voice to parliament. And the campaign was based, or the narrative was based on the idea that because Jews are indigenous to Israel, as they would say it, therefore it was incumbent upon them to support indigenous people on this continent in their effort to be recognized fully and to have their voice, which was basically a representative body that would be consulted on indigenous affairs. It wasn't anything autonomous or self-determining. That's all it was, by the way. But that's the reason, that was at least the narrative for why they were supporting it. But if we think about, the wider Zionist involvement at all levels of politics, the arts, culture, universities, and so on, which have been exposed, I think, over the course of this phase of the genocide as being not the full story, because I'm very much opposed to this idea that it's all down to the Zionist lobby. I think that's a very naive and conspiracist idea that doesn't really help us to understand the role that Israel plays for Western imperialism and racial capitalism. However, we can't deny the fact, just as I spoke about earlier about the role of Zionist organizations within education, we can't deny the fact that there's an outsized role being played by Zionist lobby groups within all of these different spheres. And therefore, that's why it's important to talk about this ability that they found to be able to build on this completely fictive notion of shared indigeneity in order to bring about, and I'll say something maybe it is partially controversial, I think, because obviously there are many indigenous people who don't agree with me. But the more radical indigenous view that I subscribe to is that actually this voice to parliament would have been detrimental to indigenous people because it would have covered over, firstly, it was a concession of a conceding of power, because it in order to be recognized by the Australian Constitution, there had to be a reciprocal recognition by Indigenous people of the legitimacy of the Australian state, which they deny. But also it made a kind of a ceding of a certain amount of autonomy where Indigenous people could manage their own affairs outside of the requisites of the Australian state. So I personally was opposed to the Indigenous voice to Parliament, as were many Indigenous people. However, there are many Indigenous people who also still support it, so I don't want to imply that, my view is more important than theirs and so on. Nevertheless, it does beg particular questions as to why, given what I've said about Zionist involvement across all these spheres of politics, business, arts and culture and so on, universities, why it was so important for a major Zionist lobbyist to be so involved in this campaign for the Indigenous voice to Parliament, right? So what's the quid pro quo? What's the mutual back scratching? And for my money, it's this notion of indigeneity, because of course this shared indigeneity is the key. And this is, again, the recalibrating racial regime, because of course in the past that wouldn't have been the key, right? But now there's a certain amount of social capital that comes along with, indigenizing initiatives in order to massage the continuities of the status quo, right? So, I mean, just to make it very plain, when I first came to Australia, which is 13 years ago, you would be hard pushed to hear somebody give a land acknowledgement, and we know about all the criticisms of land acknowledgements. But it was difficult, to get white people to give a land acknowledgement, which after all it's protocol here, right? It is Indigenous protocol to do what's called an acknowledgement of country. That's the way we call it here. Today, it's writ large. You cannot go to any meeting at the university without it starting with a land acknowledgement, right? So it means that it wasn't just because Indigenous people pushed for it, because if you ask many ordinary Indigenous people, they're like, what does that change? They often laugh about it, right? But something changed, and that's because what I mean is we need to ask serious questions about what those non-performative what actions, what they permit, what they massage, what they allow to continue. And that's what I was interested in looking at in this chapter.
Mhm. And that's the that accounts for that notion of capturing, which is part of your title of this chapter.
Yeah.
I'd like to read a quote from this chapter, actually, which speaks not only to this and something you spoke of earlier regarding, I think you called it the self-indigenization or the self-racialization.
Mm,
Also going to be in this quote I'm about to read. It's also sort of a bridge to the this other topic of the use of some of these categories and the manipulation of some of these categories in the academic discourse. For instance, in some of these names that you talk about in this book, um, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak,
yeah.
Schatz, um, and the diluting of Fanon, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so this is from page 216 of this book. First, towards the top of the page, you say, in the real world, Zionists do not exist in the liminal space between colonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial discourse and practice. Then you go on to say, the summoning of post-colonialism to nuance Zionist colonialism, like the rewriting of history to indigenize Jews in an act of self-racialization that imposes a language of blood on diverse peoples, united by religion, not provenance, to lay claim to another's land, allows for a close observation of the recalibrating racial regime. It is thus unsurprising that Robinson took post-colonial theorists to task for their appropriation of Frantz Fanon, demonstrating how the question of Palestine brilliantly exemplifies post-colonial theory's participation in ignoring the uncompromising call to arms and colonial exploitation. I thought this was just an excellent sort of breakdown of the way post-colonialism and other forms of academic discourse sort of capture the category of indigeneity, for instance, but also, as I already mentioned, dilute and defang Fanonian critique. Fanonian analysis. I wonder if you have anything to say or anything to add about this particular part of the book. Otherwise, we can move on to another question.
No, I mean, I just briefly want to say, I think it adds on to what I was saying before. I mean, many people had noticed how Fanon had been used and abused in the context of this phase of the genocide. There were very good discussions, for example, had about the publication of Adam Schatz's biography of Fanon, and Adam Schatz using, as I say at a certain point, using the opportunity of his book promotion tour to kind of rebuke pro-Palestine activists for their, as he would see it, misuse of Fanon, discussions of what were kind of patronizingly explained to be misunderstandings of Fanon's discussions of violence, which a close reading of The Wretched of the Earth would show to actually be the case. And if we bring that all together to what I wanted to say at this closing kind of few pages of this chapter was that Robinson had already, like many things, I often say, you know, there are some authors like Fanon, for example, Robinson is another. You can almost open their works at any page and you'll find something that just jumps out to you as the thing, right? So Robinson has an essay on the appropriation of Frantz Fanon, which was published in the 1990s, and he was critical of the scholars who you mentioned, who he saw as kind of, you know, diluting Fanon and refusing to think of him as a theorist of anti-colonialism and seeing him only in the kind of more psychoanalytic discussions that were prevalent in the classrooms of post-colonial theory, where Fanon was reduced to his kind of apparent concerns with identity and sexuality and so on. And the point that Fanon makes is that and he links it through his discussion of Edward Said, very specifically at that time, also to the question of Palestine. So even then, 30 years ago, people were misusing Fanon in order to deride the Palestinian resistance. And the reason I wanted to bring it up here is that I think allied to the questions of self-indigenization, self-racialization, the ways in which those narratives can be used in order to attack, not only attack anti-colonial activism, be it on this continent, Turtle Island, Palestine, etc., but also to reinstitute, settler futurities, despite ongoing indigenous resistance. All of that is true, but at the same time, you have an allied problem of the centering of, a kind of a misuse of narratives of anti-racism, or a denuded kind of, or diluted anti-colonialism, to say that if we only center the voices of indigenous people, then we will eventually arrive at the end of racism or the end of colonialism. But the problem with all of that is, of course, the scholars who Robinson were discussing were themselves colonized peoples, right? Who nonetheless were able to, through placing their voices at the center of the narrative, able to kind of defang the more radical and critical elements of Fanon. Because, of course, who was the Fanon almost the most critical of was, of course, the post-colonial elites, who he saw as being, as kind of betraying the anti-colonial resistance in the decolonizing, or the post-colonial. I don't think we should use that terminology, but after the movements against colonization, they were the ones who were in cahoots with ongoing Western imperialism, playing a direct role in basically defanging the aims of the revolutionary aims of anti-colonialism at this time, and that this continues within the kind of capture of these, through these disciplines within colonial universities, because the presentation of authors like Fanon as kind of more benign, and stripping away from him the trenchant critique of the very same post-colonial elites who are now teaching him in classrooms, right? That's stripped away, because of course that would be expose them as participants in the upholding of the status quo. And that ties again to the silence in many quarters when it comes to this current phase of the genocide, first and foremost being, you can exclude this if you like, but I think, premier theorist of Fanon, Lewis Gordon, who did say on social media towards the start of this phase of the genocide that Fanon would have been a Zionist. And I think nothing could be further than the truth, and nothing could be more exemplary of the problem that Robinson and others were pointing to.
It reminds me of, you cite in a previous chapter, Glenn Coulthard on essentially institutional practices that emphasize recognition and accommodation at the expense of the decolonial practices, or Max Eil's criticism of the rhetoric of the diffuse rhetoric of Palestinian agency and the centralization of voices, which you just alluded to, in an attempt to sort of divert attention, if not outright obscure or obfuscate anything that would be considered more practical decolonial, anti-colonial action. And so I think that's really good and really important thing to note. Thank you for that. I have one more question, and then kind of a closing question. Over the past weekend, we've seen thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people in the March for Humanity, staged in Sydney, demanding an end to Israel's genocide and an end to the forced starvation and imposed famine in Gaza. I wonder, also contemporaneous to those events, you have Foreign Minister or Minister of Foreign Affairs Penny Wong's comments, which have echoed similar comments by Macron in France or by Carney in Canada, regarding the recognition of the Palestinian statehood. And I just wonder if you have, if maybe I'll ask it in this way: how can the new racial regime make us think about these events, the current conjuncture, this march and these parliamentarian sentiments, oftentimes sort of deployed as almost like a carrot and a stick tactic,
Mm,
which I find quite perverse. And I'm sure you would agree. But I think that the framework you provide us in a new racial regime kind of opens up a new way of thinking about this parliamentarian approach, which again, as you've already mentioned elsewhere in this discussion, seems to follow this narrative of progression, of progress
mm.
away from a racialized sort of understanding of history and toward a more multicultural, legalistic recognition of indigenous peoples. So I wonder just if you have anything to say about any of the above.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting, actually. Well, there were up to 300,000 people who marched in Sydney on Sunday.
Mm.
Between 100 and, I mean, I think an estimate from an expert put it at around 225,000. So a lot of people marched in a cold, wet, and appalling conditions on the bridge, very badly managed by police. Although I think, anyway, it's a different story. But I think also the performance of the lack of control of the police was also to deter future marches. And there are kind of two aspects to this. One is the rhetoric around the importance of the march, and the second, and it's not disconnected because of course it's in response to this, the pronouncements by Penny Wong, who's the foreign minister, the Australian foreign minister, and Anthony Albanese, who's the prime minister, in regard to this, and of course the signing up of Australia together with other nations,
Mhm.
talking about perhaps recognizing Palestine with 1,000 caveats, all to do with Hamas and disarming the Palestinian resistance and entirely defanging it and placing the state under the control of the entirely co-opted and comprador Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas. Anyway, so these two things kind of come together, and I think there are a couple of things. So first, let me talk about the march. The first thing I want to say about the march, because I've been accused of being ungracious about it, is that I think if it did one thing, and I'm actually seeing this in real time, which was to bring out people who had never gone on a rally before, let alone a rally for Palestine, and to bring them to do one specific thing, which is what I'm trying to harness people to do at the moment, which is to get involved in fundraising for families in Gaza. Because this, apart from resisting by any means necessary and direct action, which I think is absolutely imperative, but not possible for everybody, the one singular most important thing that we can do here is to keep Palestinian people alive. And I've been trying in various ways to do that through organizing campaigns for a particular family that I support in Gaza, and through that family connecting with other families in need of aid. So I've literally jumped onto people who told me they were the first people, it was the first time they'd ever gone on a rally for Palestine. I said, okay, good. So how can I recruit you for fundraising? So if it did one good thing, it did that. And, because raising awareness has its limitations, right? I think many people have spoken about the fact that there are so many by now panels and podcasts and film screenings and you name it about Palestine to raise awareness, that they are in themselves losing power because awareness has been raised. Everybody's awareness is raised, and anybody who doesn't want to know about this, it's because they just simply, they simply they have nothing for, no respect for the sanctity of human life. So I think that critique is well taken. And I think also the critique by people who think and who've said that there isn't necessarily a plan or a strategy of where to go from here, in terms of harnessing the power of the march, by the organizers is an important one. There's also an important critique, I think, of the need that organizers felt to go to this, well, they were taken to the Supreme Court by the police, and they went to fight for their right to protest. But of course, there's an important critique of the feel that there's a need for an institutional stamp of approval in order to be able to do with what is, after all, the population's right, which is to protest. I mean, that is an inscribed right, an enshrined right. So all of those critiques, well taken, and I share in them. In terms of the question of the state, I mean, it really very obviously is. It does kind of fit with what the analysis that Robinson provides us of the recalibrating racial regime performs, right? It is a classical non-performative in the sense that it's a failure. The Oslo process is a failure. It's absolutely untenable, impractical, and as many Palestinian analysts have said very clearly, all it does is to lend credence to the legitimacy of the Zionist entity. And the only possibility for any kind of freedom for all of the people who live within the space that is currently Palestine is decolonization. Because both from practical terms, in terms of the just rampant, the actual materiality of colonization on the ground, but also ideologically in terms of what it permits, which is the persistence, despite its genocidalism, of an exclusively racial state that is exclusionary and discriminatory, oppressive and genocidal, alongside a Palestinian Bantustan state, is untenable from the perspective of an anti-colonial perspective. And I think for many people who say that to retain and demand decolonization is to deny realism, right? To deny reality, and to say and to strive for something that's over and above the possibilities, and the idea is that Zionists will never give up on their hold over the land, and therefore we have to accept that reality and capitulate to it in order to somehow in order to bring about an end to the genocide, are simply misunderstanding the link between the two things, because there's no promise that the recognition of the Palestinian state will bring about an end to the genocide. I mean, Israel has not said, Keir Starmer posed it as a threat, like carrot and stick, like you're saying. Keir Starmer said, if you don't stop this genocide, he doesn't call it a genocide, but if you don't stop what you're doing, we'll recognize a Palestinian state. And Israel has basically gone, so, we don't care. Israel under Netanyahu, whatever it could have been, Israel, again, to reiterate, has always been a colonial and genocidal project. So all this idea that the Israeli leaders of the past used to be better, right? We can cast that aside. I disagree with that. But the tenor, the language, the rhetoric is certainly more extreme. Netanyahu has absolutely no interest. Him and his allies have absolutely no interest. And even the generals of the former security officials and what do we call them? Genocidaires of the past, right? Who've come out with this statement now saying that Israel has to stop the war, as they would call it. None of them has said, yes, and we also need a Palestinian state and we need Palestinians to be free. They've not said that. They're saying basically it looks bad on us, guys, so we better cut it out, because otherwise we're not going to be able to go on holiday to Thailand anymore, because we'll start getting arrested, which is literally what's happening, right? And these are the concerns, right, of the grand majority of Israelis, and we need to be absolutely clear that this is what their concern is first and foremost. There are very, very, very few Israelis in Israel who are standing up against genocide, and some of them rhetorically, and almost none of them materially. I mean, there was a march of about 10 people. I could see 10 people. Maybe there were more, so I don't want to cast aspersions, but I couldn't see any more on the video, who marched to the border the other day to end the siege. And, fair play to them, but they're 10 people or 20 people. That's it, right? So I think we have to be very, very clear to end. We have to be very, very clear about what this rhetoric of recognition, very similar to, by the way, to the rhetoric of recognition around indigenous people in settler colonies, which feel that indigenous resistance has been quelled, such as in Australia, what this does to recapitulate, to recalibrate the terms of settler colonialism and to embeds settler futurity, it's not different. And people like Coulthard and so on have been exposing this to us for many years.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lentin, for this wonderful discussion. The book is excellent. I highly recommend it to everyone in our audience, all of our listeners and viewers. I in particular recommend it for any professors out there or teachers out there who teach at the high school level or at the undergraduate level, particularly because it is very accessible text, and I think
Thank you.
widely taught and disseminated as a result. And so I highly recommend it for really any reader, but in particular, any educators out there. I think you'd find great use, even at the high school level, I would suggest. Maybe just in closing, Dr. Lentin, any other projects that you're working on that our audience might look forward to? Any projects lined up that we might flag, potentially even for a future appearance on the De Facto podcast?
I mean, I have a few different projects that I'm working on, but nothing big as such. I'm still trying to think about where I want to go next. I have a few ideas, some of them more palatable than others. One of the projects that I'd like to do is a project on Zionism and European racial capitalism. Through an intellectual biography of Arthur Rupin, who was also a eugenicist. So that's one, but it's very far from even being started now. I mean, I want to flag the work of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism that I'm on the collective of, and there's lots of events that we organize, both online and in-person events, opportunities for scholars, and it's really about building the field of critical Zionism studies. So if people are interested in that, I highly recommend that they check out the website and social media and so on. That's about it. This has been so good of you, and I've really enjoyed discussing with you.
No, well, thank you. And I'll make sure to have all of the links to everything that you just mentioned, critical Zionist studies and so forth, in the description, so that they can be accessible to everyone watching and listening. Thank you again, Dr. Lentin. Hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you.